All right, so I am on site at Ravi's business. Some of you might remember he gave me a Generac standby unit a little time back that was blowing fuses. And well, today he has a couple more. And we've actually already loaded the first into the back of the truck. So still need to strap it down. But right now I'm just connecting the trailer so that we can load the second unit.
Could have used WD-40, but the PV blast is still there.
It's probably good to have TPZs out now anyway, because another year. That may not it's easy.
Is this a Tractor Supply trailer?
Sure is.
They are great. They have everything that you need in a pinch.
They do. I just ran up there, drove it home the same day.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Like, look center to you? Yeah,
Yeah, it's.
Your truck's
I think
pretty
that's
heavy.
pretty good. I'll make it. All right, we are nice and secured. At least I think we are. So I've got just less than an hour drive. So I'll meet you at the other end. All right, so we made it back, and both machines, they are exactly where I left them. So we're off to a good start. Anyway, these machines, they are obviously used. They come to us from a subscriber, Ravi, who owns a business installing and maintaining these standby units. This one belonged to a new customer. He actually hired Ravi's company to install a new one and take this one away. So, I'm told this runs and makes power, but it does have a couple issues. The first one is that the system board is blowing its fuse, and we actually fixed one recently that had the same issue. So likely we're dealing with a similar problem here. The other issue is that although the engine cranks, it doesn't start, at least without a little bit of help. The last few years, the prior owner was manually choking the engine with his hand to get it to start. So those issues should be fixable. And if those are the only issues, then we can get this machine back up and running like it should. Now, this, I believe, is 16,000 watts. We'll actually take a look once we get it off the trailer. The other machine, I believe, is an 18,000 watt model, and from the looks of it, a few years newer. Now, this machine also runs and makes power, but the engine, it's not healthy. And I guess the last oil change, there was a bunch of metal in the oil filter. So, the engine definitely has some internal problems and is likely on its way out. So we have a generator with a wounded engine and some missing parts. So, likely this will be a teardown video of its own. Potentially we could fix it. So, that we will find out. But for today, we're going to focus in on this one. So let's get it off the trailer. We'll get it inside and take a look. And to get this off the trailer, we actually have to remove this tailgate so that we can get the forklift in here. Yeah, I think before we get this inside, I am going to hoist this up off the pallet. The pallet's a little bit undersized, and I have something a little bit more appropriate just kind of hanging around. So, yeah, let's take care of that issue now. All right, so we are in. Definitely not as clean as the last one I worked on. There is a bunch of rust down here, and it looks like this divider is pretty much rotting away. So that supports the control panel, but more importantly, it divides the cool air intake versus the warmer air in here. So that we are going to have to patch, I would say, at some point. We do also have a tool that somebody left for us, so we'll set that aside. The generator, the engine, they look complete, as well as the control panel, but I do notice we have some cut wires right here. So these would have been the wires running to the transfer switch, so I need to eliminate those, at least for testing. The main legs, they are connected to the circuit breaker. We also have the neutrals. and the ground. And I also see the lugs here for the output on the circuit breaker. So it looks like we have everything we need. The battery also has a charge, and the fuse is not blown. So first things first, we'll check the oil. And the oil actually is clean. And it appears to be filled to the proper level. So yeah, oil is filled perfectly. So let's get a look at the filter. I want to make sure we don't have a critter nest and that we have a good filter. Also, it sounds like we're going to need to feed this a little fuel while the engine's cranking. It doesn't sound like it's going to start on its own, but everything looks intact. This here is the auto choke, which seems to move fine. So we'll keep an eye on that when trying to start it. But that, if it's not working right, could definitely cause hard starting. So before we go much further, I'm going to get the cover off this machine as well. It's just going to provide a lot better access. So I'm going to leave that loose for now. We've got one on the other side. Then we have to loosen up the hinges, and the cover should come right off. All right, so these two wires here, that is the 240 volt input from the grid. And the interesting thing is, it looks like we have some non-OEM wiring going on here. So they kind of go down over toward the engine. So I want to trace those and find out what that is. But let's remove these cut wires first. All right, so we've got two white wires and two black wires. It looks like one set goes down here, kind of under the engine, and the other set is going here over toward the battery. So this, I would say likely is for charging the battery. The unit has its own battery charger, but these are very well known for overcharging the battery and causing them to explode. So a lot of people actually just tap into the utility power and add a battery maintainer to charge the battery properly. So I do see a connector back there, so we'll check that out in a minute. And the other set of wires actually comes down here and is connected to the oil filter, or actually, this looks like a heating pad to keep the oil in the filter warm. So that's pretty cool. I haven't seen that before. So yeah, let's actually pull the battery out and just see what's going on with the charging system. Maybe clean up this mess a bit and test the battery to see if it's any good. And that's it. This red wire's pulled tight, so we do need to disconnect the battery in order to get it out. It's actually not a battery charger, but a heater that goes under the battery to keep the battery warm. So must be a cold weather kit, you know, both the oil heater and the battery heater. Anyway, I'm going to set that aside for now. I'm just going to vacuum up all this loose stuff, and then we'll get to checking the health of the battery. All right, this battery, it's rated at 525 cold cranking amps. So let's see if it still has that much in it. So I'll bring that down, 525. Okay, it says the health is 20%. Battery should be replaced. Voltage is 12.63. So, yeah, this battery may not have enough left in it. I guess we can load test it real quick. It's going to put a 100 amp load on it. It's upside down, but right now we're at about 12.6. When we hit this button, you know, there'll be a voltage drop, and we want it to stay somewhere in the green. That'll tell us the CCA. If it drops below that, then we definitely have a problem. So let's put the load on. And yeah, it's pretty weak. It's 200 cold cranking amps. Yeah, likely that needs to be replaced, but I'm going to put it on the charger for now because I don't have another battery, so hopefully this has enough in it to get us through some testing. All right, so we'll just get this cleaned up real quick before putting the battery back in. You know, it's quite possible the battery isn't bad. Yeah, I know this generator's been disconnected for a while, and the battery could just be low. You know, the system board was still active. So we'll repeat that test later, you know, after the battery's been on the charger for a while. You should put the positive on first, but in this case, it's a lot easier to put it on second. You just got to be careful not to ground out the wrench to anything, or you're going to short the battery out. All right, so that's going to take a while to charge up. So while we wait for that, let's connect up a receptacle to the main generator output. For that, I'm just going to use this 50 amp output. You know, it's the same one we used on the Watchdog machine, which is virtually identical to this generator. So this likely should just connect up without a whole lot of modification. Tight. And because we're going to use this as a portable, I'm going to jumper the ground connection over to neutral. That way, if we do have a hot wire touching a source of ground, you know, the current will have some place to go and trip that main breaker. So let's see if we can get the ground on. And this will be the strap right here. We'll just put this on loosely for now until we get the neutral connected, and then we'll tighten everything down. All right, the electrical's done. So I'm going to spend a second here and just do a little bit of plumbing to get the propane connected. Now, we do need to double check that actually. This can be set up for natural gas or propane. You know, either way, it's the same inlet. But there's a different orifice size depending upon which you decide to go with. And I'm going to adapt this down just to test it, you know, using a small propane tank, which might not be up to the task, but, you know, I've done it before, and it's good enough, at least for a quick test. So for now, I'm just going to finish up the plumbing, but actually leave the propane disconnected. And I want to crank the engine with the battery that's in there, just make sure it's capable. And also keep an eye on the amp draw. You know, the 15 amp fuse, I'm told, periodically blows out. So I'm going to get an amp clamp on the wire that runs down to the starter solenoid and just keep an eye on how many amps that solenoid draws. All right, so let's crank the engine. Keep an eye on the meter. And the choke is working as well. And the amp draw isn't that bad. You know, it started, I'd say a little higher, like around 9 amps, but then it dropped to about 7. Let's try this again. All right, we're quite a bit higher this time. And some of that could be attributed to the battery. So I actually do have another battery. It's not the right size, and it's not in much better shape, but I think it is better than this one as it is right now. So let's just swap the two batteries out. And I do want to crank the engine again with a better battery, because that last time cranking, that was getting close to the 15 amp limit. And I think that has to do with the voltage coming out of the battery. So let's just try it one more time and actually see if that goes higher as the voltage drops in the battery. And no, it's actually stabilized at about 11.5 amps, which isn't great, but at least it's below the 15. So I'm going to pause it. I'm going to get a new battery in there, at least a slightly better battery, and we'll crank the engine again. And this is the battery we're going to throw in here. It's rated at 800 cold cranking amps. It's a few years old. You can see we got a good state of charge, about 13 volts. And if I put a load on it, according to this, we're getting about 1,000 cranking amps. So yeah, definitely a lot better than the one that's in there right now. All right, let's give this another try. This battery tested at 1,000 amps. So in theory, the engine should turn over faster, and hopefully that current draw will be a little bit lower. So let's give it a try. And no, it's pretty much the same. So the other battery, although it was low on charge, I think it took more of a charge than I kind of gave it credit for, because this one really doesn't seem to make much of a difference as far as how fast the engine cranks or the load that the starter relay is pulling. We're close to 12 amps, which is pretty high. Okay, I think we're good. No leaks. All right, let's give this thing a try. We've plumbed in the propane, checked for leaks, we're good to go. We have a good battery installed, and the electrical is connected. I installed a breakout cord, so in one leg we have a light, and on the other leg we have the kilowatt. So assuming the engine starts, we use the kilowatt to measure the voltage and the frequency. Now, I'm not actually expecting this to start. Based on the story I got, the prior owner said that the system board fuse is blowing, and the engine usually won't start without some manual intervention. So the issues actually could be related, because the engine didn't seem like it was cranking very fast, and the amp draw was high at 12 amps. It should be about half that. So let's flip the switch, see what happens. So yeah, there is some sort of a problem here. It cranked and did not start, I did have to add a little bit of propane to get things to light off. And when they did, the engine kept running. It sounded good. We were making power, pretty much exactly the right voltage and frequency. So now that it's run for a second and we know all the air is out of the propane line, let's just try restarting it and see if it can start without any help. That time was better. Not great, but definitely better. It sounded like the engine was cranking a little bit faster, and it did crank, I would say, longer than it should have, but it did start on its own. So potentially it was air in the lines, or maybe it's just the fact that the engine now has some heat in it. So I'm going to walk away from this for a few hours. I'm going to let this thing cool down completely. I'm also going to top off the charge on that battery, and we'll try another cold start. See if it can do it on its own. All right, so it is the next day. The engine is nice and cold. Propane line has been connected the whole time, so there's no air in the system. And the battery, it is fully charged. So we're gonna try another cold start, but it does occur to me, I never double checked yesterday what this is set up for, meaning propane or natural gas. Sometimes you can look at the regulator and figure it out. There are two lines coming out of it, which are a little bit hard to see. The one on the right is for propane. The one on the left is natural gas. And, on some models, they'll just have one capped off and the line connected to the other, and you can tell that way. But in this case, we actually have two lines, and they run up here. You can see them just right there, and they go under the airbox. So to check or select what type of fuel you want to run, it's actually indicated right here. So it looks like propane is to the right and natural gas to the left. And if you look at the pin right there, we're to the left. So this is set for natural gas, which is not a good thing. So this has to be slid over like that. And where it was, it would actually be over fueling the engine. It would be flooding it out with propane. And I think I heard that actually the second time the engine ran. It did sound rich and definitely not a good thing. You don't want to run it like that for a prolonged period of time because running propane rich is going to run the engine hot. It's the opposite of gasoline. When running on gasoline, if you run it rich, the engine actually runs cooler. So in this configuration, the engine should have an easier time to start, even though it's not cranking that fast. So let's give it a try. Yeah, there's really no change. So even though we have the fuel selector in the right position, the battery fully charged, the engine's cranking slow and would not start on its own. Now, the thing I find really interesting, though, is when I gave it a little help initially, I put extra propane down here on the right intake tube, and the engine showed no signs of life until I moved it over to the left tube. So I'm assuming that one is for each cylinder. So potentially we have a problem here on the back cylinder. Maybe we have a bad plug, no spark, or an issue with compression. So before going any further with this, as far as chasing the starter issues, I do want to get some basic health checks. Let's make sure we have spark and compression on both cylinders. Plug looks basically brand new, but the gap does look a little bit big. Yeah, I'd say over 30 thousandths of an inch by a bit. And usually propane engines require a smaller gap, so I'm gonna have to double check the spec on that. But no red flags on the plug. So let's get an inline tester. We'll also throw the compression tester in there, and we'll do both tests on this side and then do the same on the other. And I also pulled the plug from the other side. Pretty much the same story. The plug looks good. Gap potentially a little bit big. But I'm going to leave this plug out for now just so the engine potentially might turn over a little faster. So I'm going to kill the lights in here. You know, of course the sun is still coming in, so it might be a little bit hard to see the tester. But let's kill the lights, crank the engine, and hopefully we get over 120 PSI. You know, this engine does not have a compression release, so I would expect at least 120, hopefully higher. All right, here we go. Yeah, we have spark both on the tester and the tip of the plug, and the compression's good. We're at about 160 PSI, so this side, no issues. All right, let's check the back cylinder. This one's a lot harder to get access to, but we got everything in there, so let's crank the engine over, check for spark, and compression. And like the other side, we have good spark. Compression, a little bit lower. You know, I'd say about 140 PSI, but definitely still good enough to run the engine. So we've got compression, we've got spark. Granted, the back cylinder, it is down a bit when compared to the front, but both cylinders should definitely be capable of running based on what I'm seeing. So, you know, I'm not too concerned about that. So that doesn't really explain the hard starting other than the slow cranking. So, you know, I'm not going to spend too much more time on the hard starting until we get the engine spinning faster to see if that resolves the issue. So before we move on and get that starter pulled, I do want to do one last check, and that's to check the valve clearance. So let's check it here on the front. We'll do the same on the back, make any adjustments as needed. And then I think we'll pull that starter out, see if we find any issues there. Try to save the gasket if I can. And it looks like half is attached to the top of the cover, the other half on the bottom. Okay, that came off clean. And it does look pretty clean in here. So according to Generac, the valves should be set between 2 and 4 thousandths of an inch. And the engine should be at top dead center, which normally isn't a big deal, but there is no way to get a wrench on the crank bolt or even on the rotor bolt to turn it over. So what I'm going to do is just turn the engine over with the electric start just a bit. We'll hit stop. And wherever it stops, you know, whatever valve is open, we can check and set the other valve. All right, intake's open. We can check the exhaust, and that feels like there's pretty much no clearance. We're right at 0, I think. So let's start with the 2000s feeler gauge. That is the tight side of the spec. And no, it doesn't fit in there. So it's less than 2000s. Let's rotate the engine and check the intake. Okay, the exhaust is finally open. And 2000s does not fit in the intake either. So these valves are definitely tight. They have to be adjusted. So let's do that now. While we have the exhaust open, we'll set the intake, and then we'll do the same for the exhaust. So we're going to open that up to 0.003 of an inch, right in the middle of the spec. So right there, we have a good amount of drag. So let's tighten up that lock nut. And we're going to have to double check it, because a lot of times when you tighten that up, the clearance on the valve will change a bit. Yeah, we're actually pretty loose now, so we need to tweak that a little bit more. Yeah, that 3 feels pretty good. And we'll just double check with the 4. 4 does not fit. Yeah, I'm going to bump the engine. We'll get the intake to open, and then we'll do the same for the exhaust. Like that. Okay. So we're loose. And this one I'm going to set on the high side of the spec to 4000s, which isn't even close to fitting right now. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but you want it to be close. So in this case, it's now a very tight 4, probably more like a 3.5. Let's try a 3. Yeah, and a 3's in there pretty loose. So I'm happy with this side, so I'm going to get the cover back on. We'll do the same for the other side. Yeah, like the other side, the exhaust is pretty much at 0. And the 2000s won't fit in there. So let's make that adjustment. We'll bring it up to about 4. Yeah, we're at a tight 4. So let me grab that wrench before we lose it forever. So I think we're good. Let me just double check with the 3. Yeah, and 3 is pretty loose in there. So I'm happy with that. We're somewhere between a 3 and a 4. So let's check and adjust the intake as well. Okay, the exhaust is open. Yeah, 2 won't go in. I mean, there's pretty much 0 valve lash there. So this one, gonna be hard to break that lock nut free. All right, we'll try a crow's foot wrench. I think that's the only way to do this. So a subscriber, Jay, sent me this after he saw me struggling in a similar situation. So this, theoretically, should work. There we go. And we'll set this at 3. Which is right there. Yeah, we definitely have clearance. And the 3, it's a little loose now. Has some drag. I'd rather have it a little loose and a little tight. And the 4 does not fit. So I'm okay with that. We are in spec now on both of these valves. So let's see if the compression came up at all. We were at 140 last time. Wow. That is a huge difference. We're at 200, maybe 205 PSI. So that is a significant improvement. Let's check the other side. Beautiful. Right at 200 PSI. So both cylinders were down in compression due to the valves being tight. You know, all 4 valves we're pretty much at 0 valve lash. So I'm going to double check the specs on the plug gap. We'll get those back in, and maybe it'll start now on its own. And Generac does call for 20 thousandths of an inch. And this plug's at 40, so it's twice the gap it should be. It should be down here. So I'm going to bend that tab in. We'll set it to 20, and I'll do the same for the other. All right, the adjustment's been made. Touch over 20. That's a lot better than where it was. That should be close enough. So we'll get the plugs back in. And it feels like the crush washer was never crushed either on this one. So I've got both plugs reinstalled. They were both set to about 40,000. So that issue has been corrected. Also, the crush washers on both sides were never crushed. So when you install a new plug, it's important to do that. And of course, we saw all 4 valves were tight. So I'm hoping this time the machine will start without any help. So although we did find a lot of issues, they weren't the issue preventing this machine from starting without a little bit of help. So at this point, I'm kind of resigned to the fact that we might have a problem with the regulator because, even though the engine's cranking slow, now that the battery's charged, it is cranking faster. And I just double checked a few other videos of this machine cranking, and they all crank at about this speed. So I don't think the speed at which the engine's cranking is the issue. I think fuel delivery is the problem here. So if fuel is the problem, what exactly is the problem? There is a fuel solenoid on the top, kind of way in the back there, and that we know is working because if we help the engine start, it runs just fine. So I don't think that's the issue. Also, in this regulator, there is a diaphragm and a valve. So there has to be enough engine vacuum to open that valve to allow the propane to flow. And I thought for sure after we adjusted the valves, that would boost engine vacuum and that would fix the issue. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. So either the valve is sticking or potentially we have a vacuum leak. And I've been looking very closely at the intake pipe trying to find a problem. And I think I may have. If you look way back in there, right in the center of your screen, there is a piece of rubber that it's loose. And I took a look at the diagram, the parts diagram, and found that the intake tube, on this side is joined like you see right here. But on the other side, there's actually like a rubber bushing that joins it to the carburetor. And, I'm thinking that bushing has fallen apart. So the engine isn't pulling vacuum where it should, and that's why the propane isn't flowing. So we actually need to dig deeper and get kind of all this stuff out of the way so that we can get a better look at that intake pipe. So I took a look at the parts diagram and saw that this airbox base, it's actually part of the mixer. They are one unit, so we don't have to separate this from the mixer. All we need to do is disconnect the wires, remove the bolts from each side, and this should slide right off. Now, the oil dipstick tube potentially is in the way, and the valve cover is in the way as well. So both covers have to come off. We have to unplug the wires, and theoretically, we should be able to get this out as one unit. And the scary thing is, too, I just spoke with Ravi about this unit. I told him what I thought the problem was. And he said, the prior owner with the prior generator company spent about $1,500 trying to track this issue down. And obviously he gave up because, at the end of the day, this is probably almost a 20-year-old machine. And to spend that kind of money and still end up with a generator that won't start, doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. Okay, we get the intake boot off. So in theory, we're almost loose. There are still the two fuel lines right here coming into the mixer, and these are just over a barbed fitting. There is no clamp holding it on, so let's see if we can slide those two off. And we also have a breather we need to remove. I think we'll be free. Oh yeah, it's destroyed. And that's the problem right here. So this is one of the seals on one of the intake tubes, and you can see it is broken, but it's also covered in silicone. So someone was trying to fix it with silicone, and actually the whole intake just covered in silicone. The other seal looks even worse. Also broken. So yeah, it's never going to run right like that. So the fuel lines, they are just really stuck on there. And I think the only way they're coming off is if I cut them off. But I don't think I need to do that. I have the access I need to the problem area. And as we already saw, the seals were completely destroyed. And someone just slathered silicone onto the problem, hoping that would fix it. So really all we need to do is just peel this off, the rest of it, get some new seals, and put this back together. All right, so I've ordered up 2 new seals to replace these broken ones. They were only $1.50 each, so for a grand total of $3, this machine hopefully will be back up and running properly. Now, I did learn a couple things actually since ordering these seals. I guess the first thing is that the silicone was installed at the factory, so that was not someone's repair attempt. And the other thing is that the original owner, the prior owner of this machine, had issues with it pretty much since new. Extended cranks, over cranks, engine not starting, and it wasn't until recently that it just became really bad. So likely this problem has existed since this machine was new. Potentially an issue at the factory putting it together. So maybe for the first time in this machine's life, it will start quickly and easily. At any rate, it's going to be about a week before we see the new seal, so we have a little bit of time. So let's deal with the problem down there. So originally I was thinking, just a piece of sheet metal, rivet it in place. That'll stop the air from recirculating back into the intake. And I think that would work. Most people would probably just do that because it's the easy thing to do and it's likely going to solve the problem. But the rust, it's a little bit more extensive than I thought. And ideally, I would just cut the rust out and put a larger piece on to get a little bit more of that rust out of the mix. So to do that, we really need to take this panel out. And it's not an easy task. There are a bunch of wires and fuel lines going through this panel. So all this stuff needs to be disconnected. And I think the control panel itself needs to be removed. And then we have a bunch of bolts to pull out. And theoretically, this should slide out. And then we can make a better repair. So I would like to try to do that. For some reason it's not working out. We could always resort to plan B and just rivet a piece of sheet metal to the problem. So I've done a little bit of prep. I just pulled the battery out and I did remove the fuel lines from the mixer. So the only thing keeping the mixer on is the wiring for the servo, which runs into the system board. So it looks like the connector just pulls out and we can fish the wire out, get the mixer out of the way. And before I forget, I'm going to put a piece of tape on the fuel line that goes toward the front of the machine. Don't want to mix those up. Okay, we get those disconnected. And they have different pin counts, so you can't mix those up. I'm going to get this air intake boot off. Interesting. There is a current clamp, it looks like, right here. And I just say it's interesting because there's no visual indicator of that. But the live wires do go through it. So just take note, one has to go through this way and the other one the other way. Otherwise, they'll cancel out and you won't get a measurement of current. But given that there's no meter, I'm not quite sure what that's about. Everything's coming apart pretty easily with the exception of that bolt right down there. It is crusty, hard to get to, and it is not breaking free. And this is why I wanted to pull this panel off. It's just not the hole that's here. There is quite a bit of rot. And even going to the other side, the good side, there is some beginnings of corrosion right here as well. The paint is a little bit bubbled, and this bolt was very hard to get out. So, given the proximity of this rot to where the battery was, I'm guessing some battery acid just spilled on there at some point and caused all that corrosion. The surprising thing, though, is that the bottom isn't rotted out. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not perfect. The paint does feel a little bubbled, but yeah, the rot doesn't really exist here like it does on this panel. So I'm going to cut most likely this rot right out. We'll get a new panel kind of riveted or bolted in place to offer some support. We'll probably get this sanded down, a little bit of fresh paint, and just clean up this mess. Oh, and we have a bolt right there that is going to be really hard to get out. So actually, let's start there. Let's get that bolt out, maybe clean up the mess, and then we'll deal with this. So it's hard to see the bolt. It used to be a 1/2 inch, and it's quite a bit smaller than that. So it's not super critical that we save the threads down here. I think this is just a self-tapper. So we can probably just drill that out. and put a couple new self-tappers in this one's place. But yeah, 13, way too big. Let's see if we can find something a little smaller to get on there. 7/16, kind of. The problem is the sides are pretty rotted out. So I think all we're going to do is just finish the bolt off. Like even like this, I can turn this by hand. Meaning it's just stripping and spinning. Yeah, let's just drill it. It's hard to know where to stop. My plan wasn't to refinish this whole thing, but this obviously was bad. There's another bad spot right here, and this area is pretty bad, although it kind of ends right about there. So yeah, let's get the oil line out of the way. I think we'll take the paint off right there, take it off in this area, and we'll get some fresh paint in its place. I spent a second and just cleaned out this whole area. So it's looking pretty good. You know, the area right here, obviously there's a lot of pitting where the battery acid hit it, but the metal is not rotten. So, you know, I do need to sand this a little bit more. Before I do that, I do want to neutralize it with a little bit of baking soda and obviously do a little more sanding. But for now, let's turn our attention to this piece. I'm going to cut the rod out. We don't need to get every single last bit of it, but I do want to get the majority of it because I want to make sure I can sand this smooth so that when I put a plate on to patch it up, that it sits nice and flush. And what we're going to do is just rivet on another piece of 16 gauge steel. But we're going to have to modify it, obviously. There is an opening here, so, we can't block that because that is the airflow to the engine. And we also have to double check how far down it goes, which is about like that. So we don't have to, I guess, hug it super close, but we do want to get pretty close. Something like that. Yeah, that's going to work out just fine. So a few rivets that'll mend this plate to the existing panel. Technically, we could probably install it, on either side. The problem doing it on this side is that we have the foam right there. So that foam is actually pretty thick. And to make the panel work on the engine side, we'd have to cut quite a bit more off the patch. So instead, we're going to attach it on the battery side of the panel. Now, we do need to add this bend right here. If I had a metal brake, we would just bend this at a 90 to kind of replicate what was there. But since I don't, we're just going to use a piece of angle cut to size, and we can rivet that to the patch and then rivet the patch to the panel. Came out pretty well. Let's make sure it fits. And yeah, it's a good fit on both sides. So I'm going to get this patch panel painted up, and then we'll get it secured to the divider. Well, it's a few days later. The paint is nice and dry, and it came out pretty well. both on the machine as well as the patch panel. So all we need to do is secure this, and this will be repaired. But before we do that, I did also receive the new seals for the intake. So let's actually start with these. We'll get those installed as well as the mixer, and then put the rest of the machine together. So I'm going to use a little bit of RTV on these seals for 2 reasons, maybe 3. The factory thought it was necessary, which is a pretty good reason. But also I think it's going to act as a lubricant and help the intake pipes go in, hopefully without causing any damage. And the last reason, although I cleaned up the silicone pretty well, there is still some on the intake tubes. And I think because of that, we're not going to get a perfect seal without a little bit of help. So I'm going to use a very sparing amount. And hopefully we're doing this in the right order. These do seem to be tapered in such a way that if we put it on the pipe first, I don't think it's going to work to our advantage. But like this, the opening is a little bit wider, and that hopefully will help guide these in place without ripping like the originals. All right, let's try that. Okay. Looks like we're on. Let's just take a peek and make sure the seals are in place. It's pretty hard to see. Yeah, from what I can tell, it looks good. I did not see any torque specs in the service manual for the valve covers. So given the size bolt, I would say 60 inch-pounds would be safe. Maybe 84 inch-pounds on the high side. If it leaks, we'll probably bring it up to 84, but 60 should be enough. And I'm going to do the same on these shoulder bolts. Although that one's making me nervous. Okay, that one's good. Let's try over here again. Okay, let's do the other side. All right, so let's get this panel clamped in place. And we'll check it for square before permanently attaching it. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Nice and straight. And same thing in that direction. I think we can remove the clamps now. And this is, I would say, more than enough rivets. You know, it doesn't flex independently of the rest of the panel. And I don't think we can really add one right here. There's just not a lot of overlap. You know, we could put another one here, but I don't think we need to. This is not going anywhere. And you can see this is what it looks like on the back side. So we have that top row, couple right here, and two more on the far side. And the seams, not too bad. We've got the divider installed, and I did put the fasteners in place, although kind of loosely. I'm not going to tighten it up until we get the control panel in place. But even before we do that, you know, we have really good access to the fuel lines. So let's get those resecured to the mixer. And I'm going to use a heat gun just to soften them up, a little bit of soapy water to help with the install. So we get the tape off. Apply some heat, and hopefully this will go on without fighting me too much. They were hard to get off, but that's likely because they were installed for so long. I think it's going to go on a lot easier. Yeah, much easier. Okay. Yeah, it might have been easier maybe to drill this pilot hole before installing this, but it's too late now. So we're just going to use a 1/4-inch sheet metal screw, similar to what was there before. All right, so I'm going to get the servo wires fed through, and there should be a connector for the choke as well. So we'll get that connected. And we'll get the main outputs through. Now, the neutrals, they do have these nice eyelets here. The live wires, they're just kind of pinched, and you can see the stranded wire is taking a little bit of damage. So I'm gonna probably improve on that a bit before connecting it back to the circuit breaker. I think I'm gonna have to cut this back. I was hoping not to, because as it is right now, the wire length is, well, pretty much cut to size. So by taking some off, we risk causing some issues. Okay, that one's good. We'll do the same to the other. All right, see if we can get this back in. This is the control for the servo, which controls the throttle. So you definitely don't want to forget this. Otherwise, there's going to be no control of the engine speed. There we go. All right, let's test this battery again now that it's been on the charger. The charger seemed happy enough with it. Usually it complains if it finds any reason to. And according to this, voltage is too high. So let's try a 100 amp load test. And last time we did this, I think it came in at about 200 amps. Battery's rated at 525. So we'll do this upside down again. And we're at 1,000 cold cranking amps. So yeah, this battery should be good to go. Yeah, it's interesting the way they've set this up. So there is no way to secure the battery. There's no accommodations for it. And this positive post actually overhangs the battery just a little bit. So if this battery kind of vibrates to the side of the cabinet, I could definitely see arcing. So I think we need to turn that sideways to minimize that chance. Propane's reconnected, and as far as I know, everything else is reconnected where it belongs. So I'm going to get a light plugged in. We'll hit the button, and hopefully this thing starts cold without any help. Contact. That's not good. Oh, okay. Maybe air in the lines. At least I'm hopeful. So, let's try it again. Okay, it's trying. Now, every time it kicks a little, it pauses. So I'm still hopeful it's just air in the lines. Okay, let's try it again. So we'll shut it down. The engine, it's still pretty cold. Let's try to restart it. And one more time. So I'm going to let this sit for a couple hours. We'll come back, try it again. All right, let's try this thing again. The engine's been sitting for about 4 hours. It is nice and cold. There's absolutely no heat in it. So get the propane back on, and hopefully it can start from a cold start first time around. I think I'll take that for the win. So the engine, it is now consistently starting in about 4 seconds, even with a cold engine. So that is a million times better than where we started. You know, we could not get this engine to start on its own unless we gave it a little help. And now it is a viable machine. It should start automatically and transfer over like it should. So at this point, you know, I think I'm ready to move on. You know, I guess the only lingering thought is the starter. You know, we saw earlier that it was pulling high amps at about 11.5, which I think is higher than it should. And the crank speed, although I think it's fairly normal, you know, potentially a new starter could crank the engine a little bit faster, maybe shaving a little bit off that crank time. But I'm not convinced of that. And during testing, I've cranked this engine, I would say 100 times. You've only seen a fraction of that. And at no point have we blown the system fuse. So I think I'm going to leave good enough alone, and instead we'll just finish cleaning this up. We'll get it fully back together and bring it outside for a load test. So while cleaning the machine out, I did come across the missing hook. The handle, though, it is long gone, but I did order up a new one. So I'm going to get the remains of the old one out and get the new one installed in its place. We'll start conservative, just a bit of soapy water and a magic eraser. See what that can take off. All right, let's give this thing a try. Now, this generator, it is rated at 16,000 watts. And the last standby I tested, I couldn't get up to the max, mostly due to limitations of my test equipment. So I've made a couple upgrades that I think will get us there. I guess first off, as far as the load goes, I've added 6,000 watts of space heaters plus 10,000 watts from the load bank. So when everything's turned on, we'll be at the max rated of 16,000 watts. The other issue was the fuel supply. The regulator that I'm using, it's limited to about 10,000 watts. So what I've done is I've doubled it. We now have 2 tanks, 2 regulators going into a T. So theoretically, this can provide up to 20,000 watts of power, at least for a short time. These tanks, they are undersized and can't hold it for long because the pressure is going to drop as the tanks cool. But I think we can get by with a quick test. And the last piece of the puzzle here is the wiring. So this, we're still a little bit underrated. The wire coming out here is only 6 gauge and can safely handle 12 to 13,000 watts. And we also have some splitters and breakout cords to make this all happen. So every connection there is increasing the resistance and increasing the heat. And once we go over 12,000 watts, heating is going to be an issue of these wires. So we're not going to hold it for very long. Anyway, the plan is to get the engine started. While it's warming up, we'll double check the output using the kilowatt to measure the frequency and the voltage. We'll use the amp probe to see what the total harmonic distortion is. and the oscilloscope to see what the waveform looks like. And if everything goes well, we'll bring on a 6,000 watt load. If everything looks good, we'll double it to 12,000 watts. And then finally, we'll go for the max of 16,000 watts. All right, no issues at all getting the machine started. So let's get this stuff powered up and see where things are at. So total harmonic distortion without a load is at about 6.2%, and the sine wave looks pretty good. So let's go over here and put on a 6,000 watt load. And the engine didn't even notice. So that is pretty good. Engine speed may have come up a little bit. Voltage is still good. THD came up quite a bit. We're at 23.4. And the sine wave, a little bit distorted. So let's give this a few minutes. If everything checks out, we'll double the load to 12,000 watts. So it's been a few minutes at 6,000 watts, no issues at all. So let's bring the load up to twice that. So there's 8,000, 10,000, 12,000. The engine speed's ramping up a bit to compensate. THD, it's now at 28.5, and the sine wave is definitely a little bit more distorted. So we'll give this a few minutes, then we'll go for the max of 16,000 watts. All right, it's been a few minutes at 12,000 watts, and everything is holding just fine. So I'm going to bring it up to the max. I'm not going to hold it there too long, but I want to make sure the engine's capable and that the propane setup is capable as well. So we'll bring it up to 14,000, 15,000, 16,000 watts. So engine speed's holding fine at about 62 hertz. We're at 250 volts. Looks like THD is approaching 30%. We're at 29.5, and the sine wave definitely a little bit more distorted. So I'm happy with that. The engine's definitely up to the task. So let's take the load off. We'll let things cool down, and then we'll shut it down. And not that I think the wires would get hot that quickly, but I know this cord typically does get warm at 6,000 watts. Oh, that's nice and cold. Everything here is cold. It is a cold day out, so that's probably helping. Yeah, no concerns at all with the wire temperature. All right, load bank is nice and cool. And so is the engine, I'm sure, although that's relative. All right, guys, and I think that's pretty much a wrap. This machine really wasn't in that bad a shape, but I do feel bad for the prior owner. He struggled with this pretty much since new, spent a bunch of money chasing the problem, and finally threw in the towel and just upgraded to a new machine. But for $3 in parts, a valve adjustment, and a bunch of time, we now have this machine running like it should. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.